over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Good afternoon and welcome back. Dictators, authoritarians, fascists are very concerned about the narrative. They're concerned about the story. Netanyahu tells the Israelis, "You need me to keep you safe from the barbaric Palestinians who want to do you harm. I'm the only one who can protect you." And obviously, that's not true. Trump is arresting and trying to deport foreign students who are legally in the United States, who might have, according to Trump, quote, hostile attitudes, end quote, towards American citizens, culture, government, institutions, or founding principles. Not only is Trump concerned about the hostile attitudes of foreign students, he's also directed his ire at American history, as well as he has accused the Smithsonian Institution of trying to rewrite history on issues of race and gender. What's the lesson to be learned here? What does history tell us about others who've done this in the past? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they take place in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events occur. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they take place, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is Trump issued an executive order entitled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, wherein he directed the removal of the improper, divisive, or anti-American ideology from its storied museums. Folks, how do you accurately and honestly tell the history of a racist settler colonial state without some uncomfortable truths being told? How do you prevent committing past atrocities without honestly telling the ugly truth? My guest is a professor in the Department of Political Studies and the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba. She is the convener of the International Manifesto Group and author of several books, including Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy. Dr. Radhika Desai, as always, welcome back.
As always, a pleasure to be here, Wilma.
Your thoughts on my open, was that rhetoric, or was that over the top, or should people really be concerned about the actions being taken by this administration?
The people should be concerned, and I think the people are already concerned. As you know, I think it's the case that, of course, on the one hand, the repression that Trump has unleashed against foreign students, against immigrants of all sorts, deporting so many of them, the repression that he's unleashing on American universities such as Columbia and Harvard, while much of this has worked, and in one respect it's appalling and it's saddening that the administrations of Columbia and Harvard University have backed down. I read in the press just now that the director of the Smithsonian Museum, which was issued with a similar order, has not backed down, and this is really interesting. And we also see that lawyers are mounting cases. They are contesting in the courts what the Trump administration is doing. Everything from what the Elon Musk's Doge or the Department of Government Efficiency is doing, what the Trump, in laying off people, in cutting off various programs and so on, whether it's US aid or payments to farmers, you name it. There has been a trail of destruction has already been created within 2 months of the Trump administration taking order, and people are appalled. And I think people are beginning to react, and this can only mount.
People continue. Oh, I'm sorry. This outright attack on free speech and this assault on history. We've seen this before, have we not? And I don't think that this should be viewed as a one-off or as an isolated incident. I think there's a much broader historic context in which folks need to start assessing this.
Well, all authoritarian orders have to rely on telling a lot of lies. And so the more authoritarian you get, and it's not like America was perfect before. There were many problems, but nevertheless, there was a certain room for ordinary people, for various marginalized groups to fight back and demand a better story. Many years ago, I did a project on how nationalism, which was at one point very progressive. So, in countries like India or China or Southeast Asian countries, which became independent after long decades and sometimes centuries of colonialism, for them, the fight for national liberation was a very progressive thing, and it was fought on the basis of a very progressive idea of what a nation should be, how it was based on the idea that once independence having been won, we are going to develop the nation, and in part, we are going to develop it not just, we're not just going to blame the colonizers, we are also going to correct the inherent inequalities and inequities of our own society, which have oppressed working people, working classes, oppressed certain castes in the case of India, oppressed women, what have you. So there was a generally progressive narrative. And from that kind of nationalism, we went to what I called at that time, back in 2006, cultural nationalism. That is to say, nationalism of the sort that, for example, today's Modi government, or back then we had the previous Hindu nationalist government in India under Prime Minister Vajpayee. So, how did we go from this kind of nationalism? So I call the first kind, the good kind of nationalism, developmental nationalism. And I called Modi's type of nationalism, cultural nationalism. And I quipped, I said, developmental nationalism offers you a better tomorrow. Cultural nationalism offers you a better yesterday. So this was the point. That is to say that the more authoritarian you get, the more you have to repress working people who are, of course, working people are diverse. So repression of working people always entails the repression of minorities, of marginalized groups, whether it is women, Black people, other non-white people, sexual minorities of all sorts, etc. So the repression inevitably involves that, because the working class contains all these elements. And so anyway, so my point is that the more you have to tell these stories, the kind of history that was told in a United States when slavery was still legal, or even until recently when Jim Crow laws still operated, was of that ilk. And what Trump is trying to do is bring it back. I mean, it literally says that basically all the efforts that have been made to correct that version of history, or shall we say a Confederate version of history, in the last many decades, essentially they consider it a slander on the American nation, and they're going to correct this. I mean, this is really something to be very concerned about, and it is definitely a mark of authoritarianism, because once you reinstate this history in which only white men of a certain type are capable of anything, contributed anything, etc., then it's easier to repress everybody else.
And you're talking about cultural nationalism ties directly to so many of Donald Trump's mantras: make America great again.
Yes.
He is looking backward. He's not looking forward. When they challenge and talk about wokeness, what they're talking about is a forward-thinking view. That when in the common parlance or current context, when you're woke, that means you're seeing reality in a different manner than it has been viewed in the past. When he talks about wanting to deport students because their hostile attitudes are towards American culture, government, institutions, and founding principles, well, if you're pro, settler colonial state, well, then I guess what America was founded upon was good. If you don't have a problem with the Trail of Tears, if you don't have a problem with enslavement, then I guess things are fine. But if you have an issue with how those realities have impacted the countries from which you've come, you might have a slight issue here, and that seems to be what they're railing against.
Absolutely. I mean, and what's more, I would say that, I'm at one level, it's very easy these days to become extremely gloomy. Like I said, at least for now, the Trump administration has successfully deported so many people in extremely horrible conditions. It has succeeded in cowing the administrations of major Ivy League universities, etc. But the tide will turn. You cannot turn back the clock in this way. People already know better. And I think that it will only give rise to a determination to fight this sort of situation. And this will become all the easier when all Trump's ridiculous economic measures, like the tariffs he's going to announce in a few hours, also begin to bite, begin to backfire, begin to boomerang. I think that this Trump is actually creating, in a certain sense, if you think about it, incoming administrations typically will take one major initiative, work on it, then they will take another one. Trump has simply come in a kind of storm of initiatives. He's doing everything at once. And that's only going to mean that all of this will play itself out. All of these initiatives will play themselves out, will be exposed as being futile or counterproductive or even dangerous that much sooner. And it will all happen at once.
Well, and Steve Bannon told us very early on, back in 2019, that this was the strategy. He called it flooding the zone. He also called it a muzzle shot. He said, we are going to put so many things out there that people won't know what to do. So go ahead.
This is a very interesting point. In fact, just as you were talking, what I was reminded of very vividly is this is exactly the strategy of people who wish to overpower the opposition. So in the case, I'm using a very different analogy, but let's cast our minds back to the shock therapy that was imposed on Russia after the Soviet Union disintegrated. It was dressed up as being necessary to improve Russia's economy, to transform it from a basket case socialist economy into a dynamic new capitalist economy. But in reality, when we read the record, the historical record, the intention was from the start to impose so many measures all at once that there was no time for opposition to develop, because they were very aware that they had taken power. Their power was very precarious. They had taken power on the basis essentially of Yeltsin signing a piece of paper along with the leaders of Belarus and Ukraine, saying they are going to dissolve the Soviet Union. And essentially that meant also the end of communism, etc. So their power was precarious. They knew they had a brief window of time. And, Trump has been elected on what looks like a very healthy majority. But in reality, his power is precarious because he has won this majority by telling a lot of lies. He has, like we've discussed before, he has told Americans that their economic misery is because of China, because of trade, and because of immigrants. In reality, their economic misery is because of 4.5 decades of neoliberalism, which Trump is not going to reverse, but which he is doubling down on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When you look at the dissolution of the Department of Education, why is that? When he talks about returning things back to the states, here's a data point. The states are already in control of education in the United States. But what he's really planning to do is privatize a lot of the services that, the tracking of student loans and all these other types of things. He's looking to privatize a number of the services that were being provided by the national government through the Department of Education. So even though they're using the terminology of waste, fraud, and abuse as an umbrella to disguise an awful lot of thievery. And as Bernie Sanders talks about the oligarchy, what Bernie Sanders really needs to be talking about is the kleptocracy.
Absolutely, and you're right. It's a kleptocracy, and we have already seen what happens when. So, what happens when such a kleptocracy takes power? I mean, for example, I'm sitting here in London today, and the situation in the UK is much further advanced than in the United States, where all sorts of government services in the public health service, which of course, as you know, in England you have in Britain you have a National Health Service, which is supposed to provide all health services free at the point of use. And what has happened over the decades is that in this health service, essentially, while the public is still provided, in name at least, goods and services free at the point of use, they are deteriorating in quantity and quality. There are long waiting lists. Doctors who are very committed to the NHS are frustrated due to the lack of resources, due to overwork, etc. Meanwhile, various private corporations, which are, whether they are administering hospitals or providing various services to hospitals, whether they are medical or catering or what have you, they are all profiteering from this. Let me give you just one example, and this will tell you what's in store for all the Department of Education services that will be privatized. So in Britain, they privatized the water services. So water and sewage companies are now private. Many of the water and sewage services, prime among them being Thames Water, which serves London and surrounding areas. Thames Water, essentially the owners of Thames Water bought it back 2 or 3 decades ago. And they did what all of these people do. They, of course, bought it at a relatively cheap price. Mm-hmm. Then they used the assets of the entity they had bought, the previously publicly owned entity or company they had bought. They borrowed as much as they could on the basis of those assets. Mm-hmm. They did not use the money to invest in water provision or to improve the efficiency of water provision. They used this money to pay themselves big dividends. They borrowed money to do this, and now Thames Water is heavily indebted. The infrastructure is creaking. Sewage is leaking out into all the waterways and seas around Britain. And there is no money. In the end, the government and the taxpayers and the customers of Thames Water are going to have to pay for enriching a tiny number of people. So this is exactly the kind of kleptocracy that you are going to have. You already have them in all the various resources that have already been privatized, but you will now see them in the case of this. And there is one other thing I should mention. Funnily, we are told that capitalism is all about, this wonderful private sector providing you with everything you need, etc., etc. But in reality, the private sector is increasingly colonizing for private profit all the things we cannot do without. It doesn't provide us with what we want. It essentially takes control over what we absolutely need and increases their prices for us in order that small groups of people, tiny groups of people, can profit. And this is exactly what you'll see when the privatization program is implemented. And by the way, this is happening because private capital is not this risk-taking entrepreneurial force that is going to, open new frontiers of technology and provide you with new goods, etc. They are exhausted. They have no way of providing you with anything new. So they are preying upon what you already need, you cannot do without in order to make a profit from it, whether it's water, electricity, education, transport, what have you. Natural monopolies are being privatized.
You've just answered a question that I've been asking for a very long time, and that is, why are the Democrats not pushing back harder? And it's because they are in on the scam as well. And that's been the answer, but that's in many instances, in many regards, that's been much more of a theoretical answer. What you've just explained at a very practical level is, just as they are being paid by the same entities in the military industrial complex, they're also being paid on the privatization side. Because I've been saying for a very long time that the Democrats need to start the conversation by asking the question to the American people, what is government for? What do you want your government to do? But the reason they can't ask that question is because they're trying to privatize the whole game.
And not only that, they are privatizing, but they are, at some level, if you had a competitive scenario in which there are many private firms competing with one another, there may be some justification to say, leave it private. They are all competing and therefore they are keeping each other in check. But today, and I would say that really since the early 20th century, we are basically living in an increasingly monopolistic economy in which, because you see, when you have competition, one of the results of competition, monopoly is the end result of competition. What do I mean by that? When you have competition, the most competitive firms outcompete and therefore put out of business the less competitive firms. And once this process reaches a certain stage, there's only one, or maybe one or two or three, a handful of companies left which dominate the field. And once there are a very small number left, either it's one, or if it's more than one, they can collude, they can become a cartel, and they can fix things. Take Coke and Pepsi, the usual. They can fix prices. They can
American
fix
media. Sorry? American media is the perfect example of that.
Exactly. So you can have that. Now, the point about monopoly is that there is absolutely, by the time you get to monopoly, there's absolutely no justification for private ownership. So really, rather than privatizing more and more, which will be
explain that point. Once you get to monopoly, there's no need for private ownership. Explain that, please.
Okay, so as I said earlier, private ownership can be justified if there is competition. So if there are, say, 100 producers, or even, let's not say 100, let's say there are a couple of dozen producers of shampoo. They're all competing with each other and competing in order to provide good price, quality, etc., because they all must keep their own niche in the market, etc. But once the process of competition has eliminated most of these and left one or maybe two or three shampoo producers, then they will collude.
Mm-hmm.
They will keep prices high. Meanwhile, quantity and quality will deteriorate because there is no incentive for them to
Mm-hmm.
provide and have a better product. And at that point, and also it also means that the process of competition has brought you one or two or three shampoo companies that have, the process of competition has done everything possible to bring it to the point where it can produce efficiently if it wanted to. So now there is no competition. There is, monopolies can set the prices they want, etc. So there is no, private ownership is only justified if you can say that competition is monitoring them. But now they are essentially like
The airlines. The airlines are another example.
Well, yeah, okay. The airlines are another example. What I'm simply trying to say is that once you're a monopoly, you don't have to compete. So all the good reasons for keeping private ownership are no longer there. Plus, one of the objections that is made is that when you have state ownership, it's bureaucratic. But actually, the big private corporations are big bureaucracies.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no need for them to be privately owned. Why should a big bureaucracy be run in the interests of a tiny set of owners who are in any case not doing anything? Most of the work is done by the workers and the managers and so on. So why should you pay some people? Why should we pay for the surplus profits of a tiny group of people? We can have we can nationalize these these industries and run them just as well, because they are monopolistic bureaucracies.
Isn't one of the major differences between what you've just described as the monopoly versus the government is that the primary interest of the monopoly is profit. The primary interest of the government is supposed to be service.
Just one small clarification.
Okay.
The purpose of every private firm is profit.
Correct.
But in a competitive context, they have to work for it.
Yes.
In a monopoly context, they don't have to work for it.
Right.
This is the key, that there is no contribution of the owners. And so they make unearned income. And there is no place for unearned income in any society.
The point that I wanted to get to with the example that you just used, what brought this to mind was when you talked about bureaucracy. And we hear all the time from the private sector that the government's getting in the way. There's too much bureaucracy. We can't move fast enough. We can't be creative enough because red tape and bureaucracy. But what gets left out of that conversation is, on the other side of that bureaucracy are the interests of citizens. So there's a reason why the pharmaceutical corporations have to go through red tape before they put a product on the market, so that, as in the issue with thalidomide in the 60s, that was supposed to be a morning after or a pregnancy sickness solution, winds up causing birth defects. Yes. So that was the point that I was trying to get to, is the bureaucracy in a government context serves a purpose, and the purpose is supposed to be the protection of the citizens against the interests of the capitalist.
And also there's another element to this. When you have monopolies, supposing you do have a private monopoly, then you need to create a regulatory bureaucracy, because the public interest requires that you regulate these industries in a certain sense. So, ever since Mrs. Thatcher here started the privatization program, and in Britain it has gone a very, very long way, Britain has the number of supposedly independent regulatory agencies has proliferated. So you are actually creating two bureaucracies. One is the bureaucracy of the privately owned monopoly itself. And on top of that is the regulatory bureaucracy that the state must create in order that some modicum of the public interest will be represented there. So that's one problem. The other problem is that back in the day, take Boeing. In the United States, Boeing has become a much talked about company.
Yes.
Now, and we read in the newspapers and in the business pages and so on that many engineers over the last decade or two have been leaving Boeing because they realize that Boeing is no longer a
Yes.
company that is dedicated to
Safety.
let's say, aeronautical excellence.
Correct.
And naturally, that would include safety. They're no longer committed to that. What they are committed to is the bottom line. It's a certain. They're not committed to industrial engineering. They are committed to financial engineering. Not industrial engineering in the cause of developing technology and serving the public and keeping the passengers safe and so on, but rather financial engineering interested only in the bottom line. And when you get that, then you begin to see that quality deteriorates. You get, planes crashing and plane doors flying off the plane in mid-flight, and all these hair-raising stories. And and what's the difference is that back in the day when Boeing was a good corporation, it was a heavily regulated corporation that was forced to be productive. But over the course of the neoliberal era, we've also witnessed a high degree of financialization, so that even companies that are producing real goods and commodities like airplanes or cars or what have you make more money by say, they say GM makes more money
financing cars and selling cars
than building cars and selling cars. So when that sort of logic sets in, you've got a completely different game. And also when a corporation is run with the intent, not, one of the other things is that today, I would say capitalists demand a much higher rate of profit than was the case in the past. And again, there's a hierarchy. At the middle and lower levels, small capitalists are struggling to make profit. Meanwhile, the top level capitalists, and which are typically highly financialized layers, they are making huge profits, huge bonuses, etc., etc. So this is why the word kleptocracy is so important, because the more money you make, the more likely it is that you are not making money through your effort, but through simply owning assets.
Is it so? People continue to talk about fascism and imperial decline, and they tend to talk about it in the abstract. Are we there yet? Is that what we are experiencing? I'm pretty sure the answer on the imperial decline is absolutely. On the fascism side, is that still more of a theoretical argument, or looking at the executive orders, the nature of the executive orders, the attack on the 14th Amendment, the attack on the First Amendment? Are we seeing that now?
It depends on how you define fascism. I mean, to me, fascism involves several different things. One is that you are, a couple of key points. I mean, there are many things. Fascism is authoritarian. Fascism uses ideologies that are exclusionary, which target certain minorities. I mean, the Nazis targeted Jews or gays or what have you. In our era, essentially, people are being targeted in the name of terrorism, but we know who is being targeted in the name of terrorism: non-white people, progressive people, etc., etc. So all of these things happen, but there are a couple of really defining characteristics. One is that, you can have authoritarianism of any kind, but fascism is a particular type of authoritarianism that is adapted to the requirements of mass politics. That's why fascism often claims to be socialist. Not because it is really socialist, but because it needs to beguile at least some section of the working class to vote for it in order to get elected, etc. So to that, and Trump's appeal to the working class Americans is part of this. So it has to have that. Secondly, of course, it has to go beyond the constitutional apparatus of repression. Every capitalist state is based on an apparatus of repression. But in the case of fascism, that is not enough. And you have to step beyond the confines of the constitution. And you can see that Trump is already doing that. Given the proliferating number of constitutional challenges he's already facing in the courts, creating this crazy Department of Government Efficiency, which has no official status whatsoever, talking about running for a third term and winning a third term. Etc. So, all of these are ways in which Trump, attacking freedom of speech, all of these things, these are all violations of the Constitution, and that will happen. So that is already happening. A third important element that at least we have seen in historical instances of fascism, like Nazism or fascism in Italy or what have you, is what I call the organization of a para-state apparatus of violence, like the brown shirts or the black shirts. Okay, now Trump has some of that, like the Proud Boys and so on, but they are not necessarily very much in evidence. So, it's par for the course. But now I want to make a deeper point. I think you can say that the United States, even under Biden, was already to some extent, shall we say, structurally fascist, in the sense that that whether it's Biden or Trump, it doesn't matter. But the idea is that you claim to rule in the name of the people, but in fact you are ruling in the name of a very, very tiny elite. You're not even ruling in the name of the capitalist class as a whole, because you are shafting middle capital and small capital. And you are doing this by increasing the amount of repression. And the relationship between ordinary people and the elites who rule them is extremely tenuous. So you already is essentially, because at the end of the day, what is fascism? Fascism is a structure of power that exceeds the repressive bounds of liberal democracy. And it must exceed the repressive bounds of liberal democracy, because ruling with the consent of the people is no longer possible, because the people are not happy with what you're offering them. So to some extent, I think that to look for very close parallels is not enough. I think what you're looking at, and remember, in the classic era of fascism in the 1930s, all sorts of critical writers on fascism, in particular Marxists, always insisted that fascism was very deeply connected with the rise of monopoly capital, because what the rise of monopoly capital does is it actually creates a capitalist class itself can be it's of course a tiny minority of the population, but the rise of monopoly reduces the ruling class to an even tinier minority.
The 1%.
And to rule in their name, and remember, even Biden was ruling in the name of 1%, actually, rather than in rhetoric. In order to serve them, you have to dish out a level of repression and a level of miserliness. So you have to take away from ordinary people. You can't give them material benefits. And so the carrots are all gone, and all you face is sticks, which are imposed in the name of, defending this or that or the other, depending on which government is in power. But it has nothing to do with the real interests of ordinary people.
Outstanding. You mentioned this a little earlier. I want to go back to Trump, the administration reviewing billions in Harvard contracts and grants, as well as Tufts and as well as Columbia University, and talk about this. What I think, in terms of another element of fascism, is attacking intellectuals and attacking academia, because the fascists cannot afford to have intellectuals challenging their thievery.
Exactly. The difficulty of having any kind of independent thought is precisely that if you allow independent thought to take place, then of course obvious uh, 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 the obvious discrepancies between what you're saying and what you're doing will be pointed out by people, will be pointed out by those who have even a tiny bit of spare time to investigate what you are this discrepancy and expose it. So you have to silence people, and what's more, you have to silence the critical elements, and you have to encourage that little that not little but that how can we say that slavish
Mhm.
chorus of people, intellectuals who are willing to sell themselves for material gain, who will willing to sing the song from the hymn sheet provided by the regime, etc. And so I think that you are already seeing that process taking place in the United States. We mentioned that earlier with the persecution of universities and so on.
Mhm.
And so, it's an open question. If Trump lasts, and I think, as I said earlier, it's quite possible that the contradictions of his regime will start being felt very acutely, very quickly, and maybe he won't last. But if Trump lasts, I think we've seen the end of free speech, of free academic inquiry, freedom, academic freedom, etc., etc. This will be it's over.
Well,
And by
you'll have to in order for him to succeed. Those things will have to end.
yes,
They,
well,
they
either they will end or he will fail. One of them.
exactly. Exactly. The moving to another element here. This deportation issue. And he says that he's deported more than 17 more violent criminals from Tren de Aragua and MS-13, many of whom he said were Venezuelan, some were El Salvadorian, sent them all to El Salvador. Now, while that's being done, we find out on Monday that he actually deported a Maryland father with protected legal status and mistakenly deported him to El Salvador, but now says that the courts lack jurisdiction to order this gentleman's return. One of the things that I have been saying since this whole thing started to develop is that people need to ask themselves, is this whole deportation issue a trial balloon? That it's not so much going to be focused on immigrants, it's going to be focused on American citizens. And that if what we see happening in town hall meetings and all of this dissatisfaction starts to manifest itself in more aggressive manners, you can look at martial law, and from martial law, you can then look at the deportation of American citizens who, as he talked about having problems with students, American citizens who are hostile toward American culture, government, institutions, and founding principles. Your thoughts?
As you were talking, I was reminded of that novel by Toni Morrison, and I don't have a very clear memory of it. But in it, a free black man is essentially captured as a runaway slave, and and because he's black, he seems he has no real recourse to do anything. But anyway, the reason I'm recalling this is that basically. Once you have created a certain type of apparatus of repression, as Trump has already created, you are basically going to be ruled by categories. So if are you black? If you're black, you are inherently more suspicious. If you are espousing for the rights of Palestinians, you are inherently more suspicious, etc. And at that matter, it doesn't really matter who you are, whether you are indeed a foreign student, whether you are indeed a terrorist or whatever, you will be treated as if you are one. And the consequences at the individual level can be disastrous. as you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very possible. I mean, look, they are saying that they are deporting illegal immigrants, but as you say, if you are Black, if you are Hispanic, they can easily mistake you for such a person, an illegal immigrant, whatever that may be, and have their way with you.
Well,
This,
and here's
this is what. Sorry.
No, go ahead and finish that.
This is what that pastor was saying, Martin Niemöller. First they came for these people, and I didn't bother, and then they came for me. This is the situation I feel that the United States increasingly finds itself in, and that's partly why, I'm saying, while there will never be, history never repeats itself, but sometimes I think Mark Twain said it rhymes, and that's where we are at, and we have to look for those similarities of rhythm and rhyme in order to become more alert to what's happening. And I would say that definitely, that's why I will not say, oh, this is not fascism was this, and no, we have to be alert to the rhymes. Absolutely.
And to those that are listening that would say, oh, Wilmer, come on, that's just a conspiracy theory. Let me add just a couple of other data points. One is the attack on birthright citizenship was not by accident, because the 14th Amendment is very clear in that regard. There's no ambiguity. You don't have to scratch your head and, well, what were they really thinking when they wrote this? They're very clear in that language. And how did African Americans become American citizens? Was through birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment. So you attack that under the guise of immigrants, and you don't then have to go too far afield to start attacking others. And the other element of this is due process, is that they deported these almost 300 people claiming they were gang members without due process.
Exactly.
So if they are able to slide the lack of due process part of this based upon people saying, oh, those are just immigrants, get them out of here anyway, you go back to the adage, when they came for Jews, I didn't cry because I'm not a Jew. So on and so on and so on.
No, and the reason I pointed out that one also has to look at the structural aspects of fascism is because such a dubious use of certain laws is being made even here in Britain, which is under technically a government of the Labour Party, which is more akin to the Biden administration rather than to Trump. So, many journalists have been harassed under these terrorism laws. People have been taken into custody, detained for a long time, and so on. And this. And actually, recently, a friend of mine was visiting from Canada. And now they have instituted in Britain, earlier Canadians could just come to Britain without a visa, but now they have instituted an e-visa system. And in this e-visa system, you have to answer many questions, who you are, what you do, etc. And then there is a question: do you hold extremist beliefs? And as my friend, Professor Manfred Bielefeld, who just gave a talk yesterday at the LSE here, as he said, what is an extremist view? Is an extremist view being in favor of the worst elements of Israel's government today, like Smotrich and so on, and endorsing what they do? Is an extremist view standing up for the rights of Gazans who are being, massacred,
eliminated, exterminated?
Exactly. So. And why is this question even there? Because then they can turn around and say to you, if you were to do something that they decide, if for some whatever reason they decided to act against you, they can say, aha, you're a terrorist, you hold extremist views, you lied on your visa application. There you are. Because it's a moving feast, it's a movable feast. What's an extremist view?
Which is what they're saying about Mahmoud Khalil here.
If I believe extremely inequality, is that an extremist view? If I believe extremely in the dignity of human beings. Is that an extremist view? This is, I mean, as I say, it's it's essentially something sufficiently ambiguous that the government can weaponize it against you anytime it likes.
And their claim now against Mahmoud Khalil is he lied on his student visa application. Final question for you. We know that Donald Trump is in just a few hours is going to explain or divulge his tariff regime, and seemingly those who have any understanding of economics are saying that he is seemingly sending the U.S. economy into slower growth, higher inflation, and that these tariffs are going to wind up sending us into recession. What say you, Dr. Desai?
Well, oh boy, I mean, there is just so much to say about all of this tariff stuff. The Trump administration is operating, like, it is making all sorts of contradictory claims, first of all, about these tariffs. So on the one hand, they say tariffs are a measure to raise revenue. At other times, they say they're a measure to reindustrialize the United States. Raise revenue from foreigners, which is completely false, because ultimately the price will be paid by Americans in the form of higher prices. They say that it's going to reindustrialize the United States. You cannot reindustrialize on the basis of tariffs alone. You have to have an industrial strategy. Correct. In order to reindustrialize, and an industrial strategy requires that you, as a government, have the capacity to tell American corporations what to do. If you don't have that capacity, you can't do it. And right now, it's not the American government that tells the corporations what to do. It's the corporations that tell the American government what to do. So there is no way that America is going to be reindustrialized in any way, shape, or form under this present regime of tariffs. Thirdly, tariffs are bound to be inflationary, and Trump is promised to undo inflation. I think the overall effects of tariffs, tariff uncertainty has already damaged the US economy.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, one of the paradoxical effects I'm reading about is that all sorts of businesses have been piling up their inventories. They have increased their imports ahead of April 2nd in order to make sure that they have enough inputs to keep production going for a while. And this completely defeats the purpose of imposing tariffs. You have actually increased imports and therefore increased your trade deficit. Another issue is that the uncertainty is likely to continue. I'm reading here on the Bloomberg page. The Bloomberg headline currently reads, "Trump tariff plans still in limbo ahead of Rose Garden event." So basically, it looks as though Trump has given himself a day to read all these reports that the US Trade Representative was going to create, and then come up with decisions. Like, this is completely like shooting from the hip. It's making policy on the fly. I mean, you can't do that kind of thing, but that's what he's doing. It's and there are all sorts of strategies which are being talked about. Trump may impose a blanket tariffs on countries. He may categorize countries in different categories and so on, and impose different tariffs on them. He may impose a high tariff and then require every one of them to come and do a special deal with the United States, which begs the question, after all these cuts in government expenditure, do you even have the capacity to negotiate with the almost 200 governments in the world? So this is all absolutely nuts. And I would say that if it is the latter, this kind of, in any form, I think the tariff policy is going to actually extend the era of uncertainty. And the more you extend the period of uncertainty, the more damage you're going to do, because businesses need predictability to function, to invest, to create jobs, etc. And that is the one thing that will be taken away from them. So honestly, I think that this guy, and some people, the last couple of months, we have been reading all sorts of attempts of people to try, intellectuals to try to discern some method in Trump's madness. But my point is, Trump is pure madness. There is no method. He essentially is trying to, he came to office simply by hoodwinking the American electorate, and now he's doing whatever little he can here or there to make it look like he's keeping some promises. But honestly, those promises themselves were premised on really problematic assumptions. So there is no way to deliver on those promises. So you will see continuing mayhem in the United States.
Final question for you. And as Hugo Chavez said about George W. Bush at the UN, he's as dangerous as a monkey with a razor blade. Peter Navarro says that these tariffs are going to raise $6 trillion, I think he said over 10 years, for the American economy or for the Treasury. Where's the money coming from?
From American taxpayers. And here's the irony, Wilma. This is the thing. So Trump has won the election by telling working Americans that he's on their side and he's going to restore the economy for them and give them back their good jobs and so on. But what is if this actually works, which is not, we don't know whether it will work, but what is his intention? His intention is to raise tariffs, which will be paid for by Americans who will pay higher prices for the commodities. This will increase revenues. And what is he going to do with the revenues? Give tax cuts to his corporate crony friends. The 0.0001% are going to benefit. Everybody else is going to lose. And this is what working Americans who have voted for Trump are going to get.
But doesn't Navarro present this in the manner that we're going to put a 25% tax on Mercedes-Benz, those that aren't manufactured in the United States, and that Daimler-Benz is going to pay that 25% tariff at the border to get the car on the lot? Isn't that how he's presenting it? No, I know that's not true, but isn't that how he is presenting the argument?
Yes, absolutely. Well, they don't really go into the details, but they make it look as though somehow the foreign producers are going to pay, but technically that is not so. The tariff is paid by the importer.
Right.
So imagine that you have, whatever you have, a Springfield, Illinois Mercedes dealership is going, when it imports the Mercedes is not manufactured in the United States, they will pay the tariff. And what will they do? They will pass it on to the consumer. Right? Now, it is possible that in order to get access to the American market, the Daimler-Benz will say, okay, we'll reduce the price for you a little bit. So that will mitigate the effect, the tariff, the price rise a little bit, because they will swallow a bit of the loss. But here's the thing. I would say that, I don't know whether we've talked about this in a previous show, but this would work if the United States were really still the consumer of last resort for the world. But this is no longer so. The total share of the United States in world imports, that is to say, if you take all of the world's imports, what is the share of the United States? It's like somewhere between 10% and 15 odd percent. It's not small, but it's not huge. Mm-hmm. And barring Canada and Mexico, which remain very vulnerable because of their deep integration into the US economy over the last several decades, the rest of the world can move away from the United States. They can say, okay, we don't want to sell to the United States. We are going to either find new buyers abroad, or we are going to expand our domestic market. Both of which are possibilities, both of which are already happening, because meantime, China and the EU already account for comparable levels of world imports. Plus, already China in particular has become the main trading partner of the overwhelming majority of countries in the world. So the rest of the world will start trading with one another on a predictable basis, as trade should be, and leave the erratic, unpredictable, volatile United States alone. Like, if you want to behave like this, we are not going to play with you.
Mhm.
That's what they're going to say. You will be the essentially the awkward kid who nobody wants to play with.
You'll find yourself in the land of misfit toys.
Yes, exactly.
Dr. Radhika Desai, thank you as always. Thank you.
It's great talking to you as always, Wilma. Yeah, just wonderful talking.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and look forward to having you back.
Anytime. Bye-bye.
Folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode. Oh, in fact, tomorrow, Dr. Richard Wolff is going to join us tomorrow. So be sure you're here with us for that discussion. And please follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show. Because as I tell y'all, we are here for you, but we cannot do this without you. Please follow on social media. All the links are below in the show description. This is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a wonderful remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.